It's the RSA Real Estate Advice Show on News Talk 98.1 WTSN.
Good morning and welcome to the RSA Real Estate Show. I'm your host, Dave Andreessen, and I'm joined by the founder of RSA Realty, Packy Campbell. He's a real estate owner and broker with over 20 years of real estate buying and selling of both residential and commercial properties. He can be reached once we get off the air here at 603-332-1100, or you can go to rsarealty.com. Packy, good morning.
Good morning. Great to be here again on a Saturday morning. It's wonderful to have the opportunity to talk about real estate and what's going on in our industry.
Well, welcome back. Welcome back.
Yeah, no, it's a very welcoming studio. I want to thank you. Your staff was very nice. They gave me this water bottle when I came in, made me feel really welcome. And then, when you drink water, it leads to the next activity, which is to go to the bathroom. And it was an opportunity to see your bathroom. And
most people compare it to a lavatory on an airplane's bigger.
I would say that. And when talking about real estate, it brings to mind a very important term. It's called functional obsolescence. Mm-hmm. And your bathroom more than qualifies. As I walked through the door, both my shoulders touched each side of the door casing. And then, attempting to go to the bathroom, I was actually leaning against your sink vanity because it's very tight in there, and I apologize to the cleaners for the incident.
That bathroom was actually just remodeled 3 years ago, and the women's room is like 3 times the size of that. So I don't know how they scored that deal, but somehow. But yeah, it is very small, and that's the comment that we normally get. It's not very it's not very functional.
Yeah, and that's an important thing to understand in real estate because and it's the opportunity to say, okay, like we always look at the his and hers closet, and we say how functional the closet's in the bedroom, and people joke, though, that's his and this is hers, and I think you definitely have a similar thing going on here.
Oh, we do, yeah.
You've got the hers opportunity, which is a nice bathroom, and the his not so much.
Yeah.
And if we were looking at this in the context of a house, that really wouldn't be a second bathroom. It would be a bath and a quarter. And you'd have to look at how functional that is. And then when you're trying to look at comparables as a buyer or as a seller, remember that my advice is pretty much the same, whether you're a buyer or a seller. When you talk about functional obsolescence, I have to be honest. If you're the seller, hey, your house is functionally obsolete. And I have to say to a buyer, hey, if you were buying this house, this bathroom is functionally obsolete. And that real estate advice is good advice for buyers and sellers. And they can go into it with open eyes and make the decisions on value and what they want and what they can tolerate, what's their budget, and say, yeah, I know this isn't perfect, but I'd still like to buy it. Or, yeah, I know it isn't perfect, I'd still like to sell it.
Okay.
And how does that impact my value? So that people have a open and honest assessment of the situation on each property that they're looking at. And that's, one of the core philosophies of RSA Realty that all of our realtors have. That we want to give you the best advice and make sure you understand the decisions that you're making based on what you're looking at in the real estate market, and especially when it comes to functional obsolescence of the property that you're looking at in particularly, and helping to discern which property you might want to buy, and then helping to discern, hey, there's no problem in any real estate house that the right price does not fix.
Right. Well, speaking of that, some of these older houses, I have family members who have older houses from the going back to the 1800s, where it was more function. It wasn't necessarily about size. All the houses now that are being built are so big and so extravagant. And a lot of these houses have these small bathrooms like that in the downstairs. Some of these really, century-old homes. So you wouldn't even consider that. I consider that a half bath. It's got a toilet and it's got a sink. But you don't even consider it that?
Well, I mean, obviously I have to consider it that it's a half bath.
Yeah.
So statistically, when you look at the task assessment for the property, there's a half bath in the property. But when you look at it functionally, it doesn't have a real comparison to other homes with a half bath that's functional.
Okay, but a lot of buyers might overlook that. If they want to buy an old farmhouse from the 1800s, they would overlook something like that. But have you ever seen some, without naming houses, some houses built in the 60s and 70s that have this same exact issue, that it's not really charming to have that kind of problem, right?
Well, I'll look at it this way. When we look at old houses, especially in the Rochester market, which I do a lot in Stratford County and Rockingham County, but in Rochester, you look at some of these older houses, even in neighborhoods, and they'll have the quarter bath. And they'll also have the bath and the toilet or grandpa's toilet. And I'm actually selling a house right now, and it's kind of funny because it doesn't even have the sink. It just literally has a toilet, and it's like a closet. But when you look at from, the 60s, the 50s, the 1920s, you might have had a larger family. You might have had a multi-generational family in there. So just having that second toilet when you had 7 or 8, 9
Yeah.
people living in a house, that was a huge advantage and a
Right.
huge plus, where now people kind of laugh at it like, what's that? But
Right.
literally I've seen the quarter bath where it's a toilet very similar to a house like that. And I think I talked in previous weeks about my son is buying a multifamily,
Right.
and he's actually buying a house, and he's like, I don't like this toilet. I'm like, believe me, if you have people over and there's at least a second bathroom, you're going to be thankful that you have it. And it's like it's literally a quarter bath. So it's functionally obsolete, but it has some value.
Okay. Let's say that you are a seller and you've identified as their realtor that something in their house is functionally obsolete. It doesn't necessarily have to be a bathroom. Other examples are, bedrooms in weird locations in the house,
Well,
like a bedroom right off, say, the kitchen or something. Just something that doesn't make sense. Give me some other examples of that functionally obsolete.
Well, I think a big example is, someone will say, gee, I have a 3-bedroom house, and, maybe the bedroom's off the kitchen and it's not really functional. But traditionally, especially in like old New Englanders in this market, you might have a bedroom where you walk through a bedroom to get to another bedroom. And buyers today, they're just not that loving in the family. I don't know if they really want to share a bedroom or walk through their
Right.
child's bedroom
Yeah.
to get to their bedroom, or vice versa. Or certainly, I have 3 older sisters. I can't imagine if my sisters had to, or if I was walking through their bedroom to get to my bedroom, that would not have been the first choice for my siblings to be living with me like that. So when you have a 3-bedroom house, but you're walking through a bedroom to get to a bedroom,
Yeah.
how does that impact value? How does that compare to other 3-bedroom houses? Not very well. And you just have to be aware of that when you're trying to look at what is the right price for my house, because there's no functional obsolescence or no issue with any house that the right price doesn't fix. And that goes back to the pricing conversation of making sure that you price your house properly for the market, that you don't want just one buyer, you want 2.
Okay, I can give you an example. One time, I was before I bought the house that I'm living in, I was looking at houses, and I was brought to this one house that I really liked because it had a lot of land. But then I walked in, and everywhere I walked was functional obsolescence. And then to top it all off, I went to the master bedroom, which was on the second floor, and there was a slider there, and that's where the main deck was, where all the entertainment was done, and it had steps going down to this gorgeous backyard, but the main deck of the house was there. And I just couldn't picture hosting parties at this house and then having everybody walk through my bedroom. I mean, that is something, that was just really kind of bizarre. But if you are a seller, as a realtor, do you ever tell them you might want to sink some money into this and change this now to make it more marketable?
I would say that's a possibility, but I think I would say to them in that situation, there is someone that maybe wants a bedroom where they're going to entertain or throw a party in the bedroom. There's a particular buyer for every house. Clearly you weren't that buyer, and good for you. So a lot of times you just try and find the right match for a property. And I typically recommend that more than making the changes, because a lot of times, you make all these changes and the property is no longer functionally obsolete and it's a much better property. All of a sudden the person selling it says, gee, I really like it now. I don't have to walk through the bedroom to get to my deck. So often the amount of money to fix those issues is not necessarily going to be recouped.
Exactly. Yeah.
So a lot of times I'll say to people, hey, we're going to put new carpets in. Well, that might make your property more saleable. But if you spend $4,000 on carpet, it doesn't necessarily make your house worth $4,000 more.
Right. You might just be better off taking a few $1,000s off the asking price.
I typically like to use what I call a sharp angle close. And people say, well, again, what's your real estate advice? My advice is you're proactive, not reactive. So I'll say to somebody, look, if it had a brand new refrigerator or if it had brand new carpet, would you buy it? So again, it's taking the angle and asking for the business and asking for the close. And a lot of times if the person says, well, gee, no, I wouldn't buy this house if it had this, that, or the other thing. Okay, well, what are we doing here? Let's go find a house that meets your needs. So again, it establishes communication. Or they say, hey, if I had new carpet and my brother-in-law is a carpet installer, I go, okay, if we give you a $2,000 credit, would you buy the house?
Yeah.
And often things are handled with a credit because the buyer of the house wants to do the work for their house.
Sure. They want to put their own carpet in.
That's right. They want to pick the lime green or the hot pink or whatever it is they want. And for us to guess and put neutral colors in, which is what we would recommend, is certain risk factors. So again, I'm a little different than most realtors. A lot of realtors would say, I want a new roof, I want a new kitchen, I want this, and I'm going to sell your house. Well, it makes their house easier to sell, but have they really increased the value, which is we're trying to be a value-added agency.
Okay. You bring up some good points about putting carpet in for $4,000. It makes your home more sellable. However, you might not get that back by selling your house for more. I know there's many things that you can do to a house that you can actually add to your resale value. What are some of the things that you don't get anything back at all? Like, for instance, you mentioned carpeting. How about new appliances or a new kitchen?
I guess, to talk out of both sides of my mouth, it depends so much on the individual situation. I mean, certainly there's, rules of thumb that says when you put a new roof, for every dollar you spend on roofing, you get $1.20 back. For every dollar you spend in a kitchen, you get $2 back. So, I mean, those things are certainly true, and there's formulas. I just have looked at these markets, and if you're in a neighborhood where the highest price house in Rochester with a view without a garage sold for $259, if you're there and you're the best house in the neighborhood, you're not going to get $269 because you do these things. But certainly you might have really been at $239, so maybe you get to that $249. But you won't. It's hard to quantify because you really won't know whether you got that money back or not, because you're not going to know the market value. Again, market value, highest price the buyer is willing to pay, lowest price the seller is willing to accept based on the condition of that house. So a lot of times I try and sell what I have, and I try to just really disclose everything that's going on with the property. And, we sell it for buyers and sellers, and we help them facilitate the best decision. That if you want to put the carpet in, it's going to make your house sell. It's going to make it, less likely that I'm going to have these objections, and it'll be a more saleable listing. But at the end of the day, if you have a 1,500 square foot, 3-bedroom, 1.5 bath house, it has a certain value range, and you're not going to get out of that value range. And I think that's the misnomer that people think that, I'm going to be in $1 million house because I did this, this, and this. And I hear this all the time, the heavy-duty nails. I have the heavy-duty nails, so therefore my home should sell for more money.
Right.
It just doesn't.
Right. Well, we have to take a quick break. We'll be right back here on the RSA Real Estate Show on News Talk 98.1 WTSN.
It's the RSA Real Estate Advice Show on News Talk 98.1 WTSN.
Welcome back to the RSA Real Estate Show. I'm Dave Andreessen, your host, here with the founder of RSA Realty, Packy Campbell, who's been a real estate owner and broker with over 20 years of real estate buying and selling of both residential and commercial properties. You can find him online at rsarealty.com, or you could call him offline at 603-332-1100. So let's talk about closing costs. This is a question that you get a lot from not only buyers but sellers, concerned about closing costs, whether or not sometimes people are going to have enough money and they get a little concerned. And closing costs can also be negotiable between a buyer and seller.
Yes, they can. I mean, I think that one of the things that people don't realize in the closing costs is that it's not, I wouldn't say negotiable, but a technique that we often use will be like, hey, I'll give you $200,000 for your house, but I want you to pay $5,000 towards my closing costs. So really the seller's getting $195,000 for the house, and the buyer isn't really getting the $5,000 from the seller. They're financing that into their loan. So if they're doing a 96.5% LTV, they're financing.
What is an LTV?
Loan to value ratio.
Okay.
So that's the ratio of how much money you're borrowing versus what you're buying.
Okay.
So a typical FHA loan has a 96.5% loan to value ratio, which means you're putting 3.5% down, which relates to your closing costs. Because if someone's, buying a $200,000 house, so they got the $7,000 down payment, and that may represent most of their savings. And when you look at closing costs, after you close a house, you need to have reserves. Oftentimes 2 months worth of mortgage and payment reserves in a bank account. So when someone says, gee, I'm putting $7,000 down, I've got $10,000 in savings, they need to keep that $3,000 for their reserves for their $1,500 mortgage payment for 2 months. So they don't have the other monies, the other $5,000 that they might need in closing cost. Typically, closing costs are 3 to 4% of a purchase price as a just general rule of thumb. What I'd kind of talk about is what some people call the HUD statement. That's what I call it because I've been in real estate for a long time, and that was the.
That's what I'm familiar with, the HUD statement.
The HUD statement. HUD standing for Housing and Urban Development. HUD being the government agency that oversees real estate. HUD being the government agency that backs most of the mortgages in the country. So they actually own the mortgages. As they're sold and resold, they essentially end up buying them and insuring them. So the HUD statement, or what we now call the ALTA statement or the Consumer Disclosure Statement, is a receipt of the transaction. So that $5,000 seller credit will be as a debit and a credit on each side of that big receipt. That every single thing in the transaction has to be on that receipt.
And it looks a little confusing because I know that the HUD statement, back when it was called the HUD statement, was a little confusing.
It was a little confusing because on the HUD statements, you had both the buyer side and the seller side on the same page. So you'd have, these two columns. It'd be debit and credit, and some would be the seller side, some would be the buyer side. And for instance, in New Hampshire, we have tax stamps. So as much as I love the New Hampshire narrative of live free or die, baby, but we do have a sales tax.
Well, that's how we make our money. It's disguised as a sales tax, but yes, no income tax, no sales tax, but you do have that. And what percentage is that?
It's 1.5%.
So every time you sell a home,
you pay 1.5%.
Does you have to own a home for a certain amount of time?
Nope.
Okay.
If you own it for a day and sold it the next day to somebody else, 1.5%.
Okay.
So the state of New Hampshire is probably the busiest real estate agent in New Hampshire because they make a 1.5% commission every time you buy and every time you sell.
Right. I know. I live in the state of Maine, and I know that you have to, if you're in the home for under 2 years, then you have to pay this tax. And I think that's to avoid people flipping houses. Or if people are flipping houses, the state's getting their cut too.
I am not licensed in Maine, so I will not comment on Maine.
No, that's fine. That's fine. But
I
know that for
I will
a fact.
say I'm glad to be from New Hampshire. It's a great day to be from New Hampshire. And I think that, we look at how we get our revenue, and, real estate and the real estate industry generates a tremendous amount of revenue for the state of New Hampshire. And, I'm not going to say whether that's a, good thing or bad thing, but I will say that the interesting thing about the sales tax is it's not a law, but it's a common business practice and a tradition that the buyer and seller split that 1.5%. So actually for a buyer and a seller, it's on the HUD and it's the same number.
Oh, okay.
So when you look at a $100,000 purchase, $1,500 being 1.5%, the buyer pays $750, the seller pays $750.
Okay.
So that's actually a closing cost that you'll see on both sides of the transaction receipt, the CD or the HUD, as I like to call it. Everyone corrects me because I'm not supposed to say that anymore, but it's hard to get it out of my lingo. I shouldn't say everyone. My attorney, Jim Shannon, says, you got to call that a CD. Okay. Hello, Jim.
So what are some of the other things that are on this statement? Or let me ask you this. What are some of the things you could be expected in closing costs? What is that funding?
Okay. So the closing costs are broke down into really two things. They're broke down into what I would call a closing cost and what I would call a prepaid expense that must be paid at closing. The most important thing to understand is that any monies that transpire between a buyer and a seller must be on that HUD statement. You can't say, "Oh, I'll buy a house for $100,000 and I'll give you Mom's Buick. I'll buy a house for $100,000 and I'm going to put $2,000 in a credit for the failed septic system." And the reason why is it's about lender disclosure. The lenders want to know, like the crash of 2008 changed fundamentally how important disclosure became.
Well, you want to hear a funny story about this? I sold my first house in 2008. 3 years later, I won't say the name of the bank, but FedEx showed up at the house with the package, with the little envelope, and I opened it up, and it was a check for $10,000 from my bank. And there was a letter in there saying that this is everything that I had paid for my closing. And I guess there was some type of federal investigation. I got everything back. Now, of course, I called the bank too good to be true, right? I called the bank and they said, no, this is what we had to do. We had, in this amount of time, we had to pay everybody back because we did not, our fair, our disclosures were not accurate. So I got $10,000 back. Is that amazing?
That is amazing.
Yeah.
I've never heard of checks actually coming back. I've seen the bills. No,
Yeah.
I'm just kidding. Typically, the disclosures are very good, but I get concerned when realtors are like wanting to do things off HUD or they lack. If you're going to be a really good real estate agent, you have to understand financing. You have to understand HUD disclosures. You have to understand the federal and state laws. And in order for me to accurately explain to anyone what their closing costs are going to be, you got to accurately just portray that this CD HUD statement is a receipt of the transaction. So you want to have all the monies that transpire on that HUD. And I'll give you an example of another closing cost. In the New Hampshire purchase and sale, essentially we have a section that says we're going to prorate the fuel. Well, it used to be traditional, and it still pretty much is, that if you have oil, there's oil in the tank, the person moves into the house, they write a check to the seller that says, I'm buying the oil that's in your tank. And that's required. Well, there's some, what I would say, confusion or some room for interpretation of the regulation. So they're actually paying something towards the house. So is that supposed to be on the HUD? And that's a question that comes up over and over again. And my advice is it doesn't have to be on the HUD. It could be on the HUD. So sometimes people will put it on the HUD or the receipt that, hey, they bought $350 worth of oil or propane or whatever the fuel proration was, and they put it on the disclosure because they'll have a lender that says, oh, my gosh, I don't want to get in trouble and have to send Dave $10,000 because I didn't disclose the fuel proration. So a lot of times lenders will require that be on the HUD. But technically, that's just them buying fuel. That's like buying groceries. It's really not related to the real estate transaction, and it's specifically disclosed and called out in the purchase and sale.
Okay.
So it's not an undisclosed, hey, here's $2,000. Please go forward with the transaction. I know you were thinking about not closing today at 12:15, but I'll give you $2,000 in a plastic bag. I really need you to close.
Yeah.
That would be illegal.
Yeah.
And a very bad piece of advice if anyone says to a seller, hey, cut the buyer a check directly for some reason. Because, again, the reserves that they have to prove where the funds come from, and they have to have that receipt, or lenders will get fined, realtors get fined, buyers and sellers could get fined. We take very serious the need to have very good financial disclosures.
Okay, we just have a few more minutes here on the RSA Real Estate Show. We're talking about closing costs, and also in the closing costs, you also have to wrap in your escrow account to fund your escrow account, your taxes, insurance, right?
That's correct, and that's the part of the closing costs that we call prepaids.
So typically, how many months do you have to prepay for, say, taxes or your insurance?
Typically too many, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because, here these people are, they're trying to get their down payment, they're trying to pay their closing costs, and then they got to pay their taxes 6 months in advance in escrow. So it depends on the time of the year that you close. So in the state of New Hampshire, you got to understand that we pay our taxes is in June and December. We're in Dover today, correct?
Yep.
Dover is actually one of 3 communities in New Hampshire that pays their taxes 6 months behind, which is different than almost every other community around here. Typically, you pay your taxes 3 months behind and 3 months ahead. So when you're paying in June, you're really paying 3 months ahead and 3 months in the arrears.
Okay.
So that creates some confusion on the HUD statement. So the seller might have paid their June tax bill and they're closing. Let's just say, for example, we're closing June 30th. The seller paid the June tax bill. What's the proration? 0, because that's the perfect day to close, because the seller paid for the 3 months prior and the buyer's going to pay for the 3 months in advance. But what would happen for the buyer is they'd have to reimburse the seller the 3 months that they already paid.
Okay, I see.
So it's really about reimbursing the seller. Okay, I got to give him 3 months. And then they say, okay, we're going to get a December tax bill, and the bank has an escrow requirement that has to say by December, we want you to have a 2-month surplus. So now they're reimbursing the 3 months that the seller already paid, plus they're paying 2 months worth of taxes. So in that scenario, you're paying 5 months worth of taxes.
Yeah.
And if your taxes are $400 a month,
right,
it's a pretty significant number.
It is.
And depending on when you close, that number could be as much as 8 months.
Right.
And sometimes, again, depending on the lender that you use, and a lot of people only shop rate when they look at lenders, and I make advice on how do lenders interpret these regulations and what's the best fit for you as a lender. And we can talk about that in a future show.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're running out of time. I tell you what, this show just flies by, doesn't it?
It does. It does. It's enjoyable. I like to talk.
Yeah. Well, good. Well, I appreciate you coming in today. It's Packy Campbell. He's the founder of RSA Realty. He's been an owner and a broker with over 20 years of real estate buying and selling experience of both residential and commercial properties. You can find more about RSA Realty online at rsarealty.com. You can also email PACKYC@rsarealty.com or give him a call in the office once he gets off air here at 603-332-1100. So thanks for joining us here on this Saturday morning. This has been the RSA Real Estate Show on News Talk 98.1 WTSN.